the other elements there, there are no lines on that triangle. It's an illusory set of contours. Did a lot of work in this, amazingly enough, published a paper in Nature. I've never ever published another paper in Nature, but it was the first time I had become involved in research, and again was really excited about it. I also realized I never really cared all that much about math or tech per se, but rather what math and computing enabled me to do. And so I quite literally, after I had taken the LSAT law school entrance exams, ditched law school plans, and decided to go to graduate school in cognitive science. Now, I didn't really know much about what one could do with a PhD in cognitive science. This is the Brain and Behavioral Sciences building at Indiana University where I went. But I did know that you could be a professor if you had a PhD in some topics. So I set that as my goal as I entered graduate school. I did research in two different but related areas throughout the 4 years that I was in graduate school. The first area was on visual development in infants. This is an example of a setup that we use with infants younger than this one, typically children 2 to 4 months of age, to understand the development of stereopsis. That is the coordinated views that the two eyes can produce that give you a sense of 3D from 2D stimuli. I also looked at the development of smooth pursuit and saccadic eye movements. And so did some, really interesting work in this with young infants. But I spent most of my time doing work on what we called automatic and controlled processing. If any of you have read Danny Kahneman's book on thinking fast and slow, he does a much more accessible description of what it means to understand some of our abilities to operate really effortlessly or automatically or fast versus some of the much more deliberate processes that we need to solve many problems. And so I was very interested in understanding what made some tasks really easy and others very hard, and how you can move from effortful processing to this more effortless processing. And during and it was fun. I had a great set of lab mates. It was probably the first time in my life where I took studying really seriously. And it was, if I look back on it, perhaps the most exciting 4 years in my career. It was a time when I was free of lots of responsibilities and able to do research. I did learn a lot of lessons about the need to be creative in getting signals from infants, especially who are only 2 to 4 months of age. They don't respond to questionnaires or surveys very well. They can't tell you what they're thinking. So a lot of creativity was involved there. There's also a lot of creativity in general in designing experiments that are efficient, that are set at the right level of abstraction, sort of not too detailed to be an uninteresting result, even if beautifully executed, and not too high level that you can't make progress. I also learned, perhaps for the first time, the need to be patient and persevere. I was looking at learning in humans that took months or even years. I mean, I worked with some people who came to the lab every year for 3 years. And so I learned to take a much longer term perspective on my research goals. And then when I finished grad school, I told you I was all set to become a professor at a university. That was my aspiration. And indeed, I applied to many faculty positions. I was lucky enough to have several offers. And then very near the end of this search process, my advisor came to me and said, hey, they're starting a new cognitive science group at Bell Labs. It's going to be the first human-computer interaction group. Really exciting. I know Tom Landauer, who's heading it very well. And I basically said, no, I'm not interviewing anywhere else. I have some great jobs. And he really twisted my arm, finally convinced me to do it. I did it very reluctantly. But when I was offered the position at Bell Labs, I mean, I interviewed, was lucky enough to get an offer. I wound up taking it. And again, it's because as I interviewed, I learned a lot about the new possibilities for impact that this offered. Frankly, I had no idea what life in industry was like. I had never done an internship except at another university. But what really sealed it for me was not my advisor, not the people I met at during my interviews, but an undergraduate professor who called and congratulated me on this position. And when I said I wasn't going I didn't think I was going to take it, he said, literally, you ought to have your head examined. And his rationale was, look, you have the opportunity to be at the start of something new. If if it suits you, that's fabulous. There's very few times other than the start of your career when you have flexibility like this to try new things. And, if it didn't work, I could always apply for faculty positions again. And so I took it, and that was 40 years ago. I've been in industrial research labs since then. So I think it has suited me very well. And as I said before, it was a really exciting opportunity to be at the start of something new. This was Tom Landauer is the guy on the left. You can see a younger version of me, two other colleagues who were hired to start at exactly the same time, Luis Gomez, who's a professor now at Berkeley, and George Furness, who's a professor at Michigan. This was the time to start something completely new, work with a variety of colleagues, not just in cognitive science, but there were psychoacousticians, there were people doing superconductivity, doing fabrication of chips. I mean, Bell Labs was just really amazing in its breadth from the physical to the natural sciences. And so it was an amazing intellectual environment to be at. This was also the dawn in many ways of the electronic information systems. One of the first things I became excited about was how people seek information from other sources, from external sources. As I said, I'd done a lot of work in graduate school on how people find information from their own heads, but we knew virtually nothing about how people got information from external sources, whether those were other people or whether they were these really newly emerging electronic information systems. And as I looked at that with Tom, Lewis, George, and others, one problem just hit me over the head over and over and over again. And it is the problem of what I called vocabulary mismatch. That is that the way people who create information describe things is not always the same as the way that people who are seeking information look for things. And so there's this kind of impedance mismatch between what I'm looking for and know how to articulate and what domain experts have put out there in sometimes very different language. You see this, we saw it in card catalogs, in the Unix command names, and any other kind of commands for computing systems. We see it today in web search, perhaps most prevalently. I mean, I'm sure you've all experienced things where you're looking for information that you know is on the web and don't know how to describe it in ways that the content creators described it. And so we developed many ways to mitigate this impedance mismatch or vocabulary mismatch between the way that creators index, if you will, information and the way that people seeking that information think about it. We developed lots of methods. Adaptively changing indices was one. The one that I'm proudest of is something called latent semantic indexing or latent semantic analysis. And it is basically a very early method for word embedding. Many of you have probably heard about things like Word2Vec, BERT, and some of the large-scale language models. This was one of the earliest large-scale for its time word embedding techniques. It didn't depend on deep neural networks. It depended a lot on linear algebra. It did, as we had hoped, improve information access, by reducing the dimensionality of a problem from as many dimensions as you have unique words to a much smaller number of semantic dimensions. We were able to improve information access. We were also able to use it for lots of other things. Like we used it to take the test of English as a foreign language. It's a multiple choice test. And we're able to do as well as the average test taker, which was a bit of an eye-opener for us. And for those of you who are involved in machine learning, you know that today word embeddings have really taken on a life of their own as representations that are used to back search, question answering, more general language understanding, language generation, and so on. And so it was really fun, now that I look back on it, to do something that in many ways led to a lot of the insights that are driving today's word embedding techniques. This was an amazing experience. Everyone in this picture above had their own perspective on problems having to do with information access, but we came together around shared interests and did so much more than any of us could have done individually. It was probably my first experience in working in a team. And I spent, I don't know, 8 or 10 years of my career, not on this paper, but on a variety of related questions. Wrote a paper called The Trouble with Unix and things like that. But much of this work came together in a paper, this paper on latent semantic indexing that we published in 1990. It is by far my most cited paper. I think it's gotten something like an average of 600 citations per year over the last 30 years since it was published. So it does have it has had a lot of impact in the field, not just of computer science, but of cognitive science, even philosophy. And so that's really exciting memories that I have, certainly of that time. And then let me switch gears to my time at Microsoft Research. So about 25 years ago, I joined Microsoft Research. This is Building 99 in Redmond. I was not looking for a position. I was quite happy at Bell Labs. But a former postdoc who had spent a few years with us at Bell Labs was starting to do a lot of early work on search in Windows and Office and so on, and said, hey, MSR, Microsoft Research, is this new thing. They're looking for people. Maybe you'd be interested. And again, I was not terribly interested. I said I'd stop by on my way to another conference, and I did. At that time, and again, was offered a job and wound up taking it, because I was excited about the opportunities that it provided. So Microsoft Research at that time was about 6 years old. It had a little over 100 people. Microsoft itself was only 20,000 people in 1997 when I joined. Here's an example of my webpage from that era. I was younger. I used New Times Roman font in everything. This was Microsoft Research's homepage. It is, it's a picture of exploding computers, imploding heads. Needless to say, Microsoft Research now has a much more sophisticated web and social media presence, and it's grown to about 1,500 researchers in 8 or 9 labs now distributed across the US, Europe, Asia, both India and China. And it's a really vibrant research community. It's much larger than any single computer science department that I can think of, even your neighboring big computer science department in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Microsoft itself has grown to, 150,000 or 200,000 people. One of the things that the move to Microsoft Research made me realize, it's something in retrospect that I should have known all along. And that was, but I didn't. And it was just such a stark realization when I went there. At Bell Labs, as I just described, I did what I'm really proud of in work that was well rewarded there. But Bell Labs was fundamentally about switching phone calls, about network telephony. And so my research, we did amazing things with telephone operators. But, at Microsoft is fundamentally about helping people create, manage, and make sense of information. And so my interests just aligned much more tightly with in many ways, what Microsoft does. as a company. And that has been just incredibly seductive and invigorating when people are literally clamoring at your door to say, can you help us solve this real problem? And so I've worked on many different things over the last 25 years at Microsoft Research. Almost all of them are at this really interesting intersection between information retrieval, machine learning and AI, and human-computer interaction. I think you can't have any of those without the other and design great systems. So let me tell you about 3 things that I've worked on very, very briefly. I'm happy to provide additional references. The very first thing I worked on was email spam filtering. This happened literally the first month I was there. I was talking with David Heckerman and Eric Horvitz, who were colleagues, both very distinguished scientists, and Moran Sahami, who was an intern with us. He's now a professor at Stanford. And I was interested in text classification, and this seemed like a really interesting text classification problem. You want to discriminate spam mail from non-spam mail. And so we got a long way technically toward building, I think, a pretty impressive spam mail filter in the 3 months that Moran was with us. There was not, frankly, a lot of demand for spam filters at that time. I think researchers who are always on the bleeding edge of technology realized that we were about to hit adversarial situations in email, especially as it became more prevalent. But at that time, Hotmail had 8 million users. There were, I just looked this up last night. I think it was 6 billion email messages sent per year worldwide. So that's about 16 million a day. Today, that volume of email messages is sent every less than 2 seconds. There's over 300 billion email messages sent every day. So we were a little early on in solving a real problem that people were experiencing, but I think we were right on the cusp of identifying a problem that would be there. And Outlook Mobile really got it. They decided to work with us to scale this pretty clunky research system written mostly in Perl at the time. They worked with us to scale it, to deploy it to millions of people. And this quite possibly is the first real AI deployed system at Microsoft. It's been in continuous operation for more than 22 years. And so I think it was really fun to be on the leading edge of that. Another thing that I worked on is a system called Stuff I've Seen. And as the title suggests, it is a system that allows you to access information that you've seen, regardless of which information silo it came in. We all live in siloed information spaces. In this, I've shown like a file system, the web, email, desktop, content, and so on. So there is, and this only continues, this proliferation of silos has just blown up over the last decade or so with a proliferation of devices and web services. So, but this system was designed to provide unified access to all this information. We weren't trying to collect it all in one place, but simply to index it all as you saw it and to provide unified access. It was a big hit. In research, we wound up supporting this capability for all of Microsoft for 2 or 3 years until Windows wound up, adopting it as some at least of the algorithms as core capabilities in Windows. Today, this has really become, as I just said, a much more complex and challenging problem, because just think of all the ways in which you see information and how you might provide unified access to that in a way that was technically scalable and perhaps more importantly, cognitively aligned with the way that you want to manage and find information. So we don't, I think, have as good a solution as we had a couple decades ago when most of the information was on a single machine under your desk. And it's certainly something that I long for every day and continue to try to pursue this vision. And so the last thing I want to mention is a lot of work that I've done on context in search, a personalized search. And this, again, is motivated by an observation that I had in working with our Bing search team. So I've done search at all sorts of scales, from the desktop to enterprise to web. And that insight is the following. Different people who issue the same query can mean very different things by it. Right? There are some obvious examples of synonymy, of polysemy, where the same word means many different things. The word apple could refer to a healthy fruit or a computer company. But there are also cases where two people might issue the same query, like weather, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and go to different sites because of preferences. And so there's a lot of diversity in what people mean by the same query. And so if you're running a big web search engine and you use a single ranking for every person in every context at every point in time, you are fundamentally limiting how well your system can do. And so, we've built algorithms over many years looking at how we can identify what's relevant to the same query based on who is asking the question. Maybe just their acute behavior in the recent search session, or longer term interests and preferences, where they are, when it is, and so on. And this has, I think, many of the web services that we all deal with have this kind of personalization, either set explicitly through preferences or implicitly through previous consistent behavioral interactions. And for as Vicki mentioned in the introduction, over the last few years, I've been doing a little less research and a lot more technical leadership as both a technical fellow and lab director of 3 labs. I enjoy that in very different ways, but really find it interesting to keep my hand on deeply technical things, whether my own or things about people who are working in the labs. I just want to understand the details, the possibilities, and the interesting things that happen when you bring together different perspectives. So let me just end with a couple of thoughts about some things that you might be able to do to jumpstart a research career, and then go on to some general reflection. So one thing is, I think it's really important to look for opportunities outside of the university. In many ways, when you finish your undergraduate degree, you will have spent 15 years of your life, of your maybe 20-year life, in school. Pop that bubble a little bit. Get outside of the university or the school. An internship is a really low-risk way of doing this. I think it provides you a lens into what might happen, whether there are things that you'd be interested in. It could be at industry. It could be at a startup, in a local nonprofit. It could be in the government. There are lots and lots of things going outside of classrooms. And I encourage everybody to, pop that university bubble and look a little bit outside. I didn't do it as an undergrad or as a graduate student. And I think I sort of backed my way into some very different things, but this is just a really low risk way of understanding opportunities that exist outside the university. The second thing I want to mention is, especially to this group, is I think, when you think about industry, large industry in particular, or even tech startups, you think of software engineering or maybe program management, but there's a lot of other skills and tech that are needed at any company. I described some of my work in research, but there's all sorts of opportunities in data sciences, social sciences, design, policy, and so on. And I think it's so even if you aren't a software engineer, aren't a researcher, there are a lot of opportunities, and I encourage you to take advantage of those. Teams in industry tend to be much more interdisciplinary, which really resonate with me. I mentioned, I think, that at Bell Labs, it was really exciting to be able to work with a set of like-minded people to do things that were above and beyond what I as an individual can do. And you'll find a lot of that in industrial roles. And then the last is that I think technology is increasingly pervasive in so many of the services that we interact with and decisions we make every day. You know, if I just look at search, web search in general has gone from being this really arcane skill that only librarians possess to something that is quite literally a core fabric of our everyday lives. I mean, we all search every day. I have grandchildren who search every day to find all sorts of things, to find information, to buy things, to monitor breaking news and events, to understand medical conditions. These are important decisions. And I think more now than ever, we really need to take a broad socio-technical perspective to design such systems in ways that are responsible and ethical. And that requires much more than strictly a computer science or a tech-centric point of view. And everybody at this meeting has a responsibility to help and do this. I know that Harvard has just started an embedded ethics program, and I think where ethics is taught as part of every computer science course, and they're branching out to other engineering courses. I think it's a really important way to make sure that people think not just about the algorithmic details, which are exciting and fun and tough, but really what happens when these technologies are unleashed in a way that we need to think about upfront rather than after the fact. And so let me just end with by taking a step back and reiterating things that I think have really been perspectives that have really been important for me and consistent over time. The first is to be purposeful in setting directions and goals. Have a point of view about what you want to do. This really helps you set priorities and focus on things that matter to you. The second is be passionate about what you do. Different people are motivated by different things. I tend to be somebody who sees things that annoy me, whether it's this vocabulary mismatch or email spam or lousy search results, and I try to fix them. They may not be things that are problems today, but that given my knowledge of the technology trends will be problems in the future. And I've always been passionate about solving these problems. Different people are motivated by very different things, but if you can find your passion, pursue it in these ways. And the last thing is, be persistent in your pursuits. Don't give up after the first failure. I've had way more failures than successes. Learn from failures, but also take time to celebrate successes, both small and large. And lastly, don't wait for inspiration or passion to find you. Don't sit back passively and wait, assume it'll happen. Go out there, grab it, explore, continue to learn, and seize opportunities when they arise. And perhaps most importantly, have fun doing it. So with that, I will stop, and I think we still have some time for questions. I'm going to stop presenting so that I can see people. So thank you all for your attention. And
right. Thank you so much, Susan. This is really great. We did have a lot of questions in the chat, so okay. I'll just go in chronological order. From Samita, a question was, how did you decide / know that this was the field that you wanted to pursue? This being HCI and information retrieval.
I didn't, I wanted to be an environmental lawyer when I started out. And then I realized that I was interested in this interesting intersection of people and technology. I didn't realize that it would be HCI, IR, AI. Gosh, I'm not sure that the term AI existed, but it was not as as certainly ubiquitous as we see it today. And so some of it is seek, and it was not really till Bell Labs when I started working with new information access systems that I thought, this is important. Everybody is going to need to use these, not just quite literally the guys down the hall in the Unix room who are developing systems. And that's probably one of the bigger lessons that stuck with me, is the need to bring different perspectives to design and technology. But I don't think I had visions about things I wanted to do, but they evolved and emerged over time as I changed and as the environment around me changed. Web search did not exist 25 years ago. People went to the library. People used yellow pages to find information. And so I've been lucky enough to be able to maintain this, what I think is a really important dual perspective as a behavioral scientist and as a mathematician and computer scientist on problems that I think matter. What those problems are have certainly changed over time.
Yeah, for sure. I also, another participant, Padmi, I think she was interested in the roadmap for data science, as you mentioned, just like starting a career in data science, especially given like all the changes that it's going through. Because and a lot of people have had interest in the chat about like pursuing careers in data science. So we were wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. So I would do a few. Yeah, data science didn't exist as a discipline when I was around. It didn't even exist as a proper profession within Microsoft until the last decade or so. And Microsoft continually, adapts its professions and over time. What would I do to set myself up for success there? The first is to be strong in fundamental. So, the extent to which you can take courses in, computer science, those are, I think, form a lot of the foundations of, data science. And then get your hands dirty with real problems. One can always start with some Kaggle challenges that are out there. But what you're going to need in practice is not just to have a data set nicely cleaned up and tidied, but for you to think about what the right data to collect is, how to pre-process it, how to impute missing data. And so I think the more you can get your hands wet through internships, through projects at the university, I do that. So I'd say strong foundations and practice, that mix, and also be willing to learn and evolve.
Yeah, definitely. Along that line, Shubha was curious, because there's so much more than, like, as you mentioned, software engineering program management. How can we decide and like set priority for a particular field, because there's so many out there? Should we start learning multiple at once or just stick to one?
Well, the people who are software engineers and program managers often have pretty similar backgrounds, certainly technical program managers. I guess, again, if you are able to do an internship, I think it will give you a sense for what those roles look like in practice. I'd say, people who wind up doing engineering tend to focus much more on core technical challenges, but program managers are clearly people who need to be strong technically. Well, at Microsoft at least, maybe strong technically. They need to understand technical capabilities and limitations in order to pull many pieces together. So you also need a lot of technical skills. But if you prefer to pull lots of pieces together, bring things together from different perspectives, stay on top of people to make sure that things are delivered, then something in program management may be a better fit. But if you can do an internship and see that in the wild, I think that will give you a sense for what resonates with you. Microsoft in Cambridge, in the NERD building, the Microsoft building in Cambridge is called the New England Research and Development Center, and it's abbreviated NERD. has an interesting program called MADAP, where they hire students, recent students with an undergraduate degree, to come in and spend the first 2 years of their career on essentially rotation with a team of 4 other people. And so that exposes you to lots of different roles and perspectives. If you, in a really, in a way that's hard to replicate elsewhere. And I suspect that other companies have that as well. Joining a startup would do the same thing. In a startup, one needs to do everything. And so even at Microsoft, people who start out as program managers become engineers and vice versa. So really, it's more a question of what you're passionate about, whether it's solving engineering challenges, sometimes in more or less isolation, or really pulling together lots of different perspectives, or in data science, in going from a fire hose of data to providing interesting and actionable insights.
Yeah, and I think like, even now you're wearing several hats at once, and like a lot of people were curious about like the way you balance being a technical fellow and a managing director in addition to being an adjunct professor, especially like how do you prioritize balancing teaching and research, or like even the time commitment?
So as I said before, the amount of time I devote to those has varied over time. So, as a technical fellow at Microsoft, I'm expected to be a technical leader for the company in areas that I know about. And I do that through, that is a really high priority for me. I'm also took on managing 3 of the 8 research labs 2 years ago. And needless to say, it's been an interesting time to take on that role. The labs are in 3 different cities, 2 countries. And so I need to work really hard at that. Those 2 are my first priority now. But I also, as an affiliate faculty member, I occasionally teach. I help in recruiting new students. But that's the one that has ramped down. Yeah.
Yeah.
11 directing students. It's so much fun.
Yeah. No, it's super inspiring. I know, like, and
for me,
everybody in the chat.
let me just say one more thing about that.
Yeah.
I have a set of priorities, ways I want to spend my time, and I reflect on those pretty regularly. And if I am not spending my time in a way that is what I have set out for myself, something has to give, and I need to reprioritize. It could be saying no to all external commitments, and I do way fewer of those than I have done in the past. It could be just saying, I need to get some help. I need to figure out how to offload some things. And so again, be conscious of what your priorities are and make sure to constantly, address those. There are times when I realize I'm not spending any time with family and friends. And so I need to, and during the pandemic, I've been much more deliberate about carving out time for my health, forcing myself to get out of my apartment or every day. I've missed 3 days in 2 years, but
wow.
it's deliberate, very, very intentional and deliberate.
Yeah, I think with time, especially being intentional about where you spend it is so important.
Yeah, and if one last thing, realize that in any career, you're not alone. And so I've always tried to, more in the last 2 years than ever before, curate what I call Team Sue. And those are people who I can turn to. They're official mentors. They're people who are willing to go out for a walk with me when I'm frustrated and tired. Just people who I can bounce ideas off of. It's so easy when things become overwhelming to recoil, to turn inward. And I just think it's really important to have a set of friends, family, professors, colleagues who you can just turn to for support and inspiration.
Yeah, definitely. I know my own support system has been very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that sort of brings us to the end of our session. But
Okay.
thank you so much, Susan, for spending an hour with us and telling us about like your experiences and your journey to now. Yeah,
Thank you,
I
everyone.
believe
It's been
yeah.
really fun to talk to people who are in very different career stage than I'm at now. And always wonder about how to resonate and speak to that. So hopefully some of these insights are have provided some interesting perspectives for you. So thanks so much for the opportunity, and have a fabulous rest of the day. This is an amazing conference too. And so
Yeah.
thank Vicky and Iris and Melody and Lauren and everybody who've worked really hard to make this happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for agreeing to speak at this conference.
Okay.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
With that, goodbye.